question is that the motion be agreed to. I call the Honourable Leanne Dalzell.
Mr Speaker, the Labour Party, of course, will support the bill, but let me say that for something that is called a regulatory reform bill, it is the most inefficient use of Parliament's time that the Minister for Regulatory Reform and indeed the government has imposed on this Parliament so far. And I have to say, given some of the legislation we've had in this House, that takes some doing. Mr Speaker, last Tuesday, it was only 2 days ago that we debated and referred to the Commerce Select Committee the Regulatory Reform Bill. Why on earth wasn't this a schedule to that bill? I mean, it would have made absolute sense for this bill to be included within the legislation we have already had referred. So I want to ask the Minister why this is a separate bill, and perhaps one of his acolytes who gets up to speak on it could perhaps explain to us why there's a separate bill doing this when we had a regulatory reform bill in front of the House just 2 days ago. And in fact, it's already been referred to the Select Committee, and we will be advertising and calling for submissions as is standard practice, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, the first principle of the Code of Good Regulatory Practice is efficiency. Number one, efficiency. What is efficient about two separate bills taking up the House's time with this debate this afternoon? What is efficient about two separate references to the Select Committee? The Select Committee that I chair, the Commerce Committee, we are an extraordinarily busy Select Committee, and we don't need to have our time wasted when it could in fact be compacted into a single piece of legislation. Mr Speaker, what is efficient about doubling the cost of the advertising for submissions when the two bills could have been advertised together? This does not meet the number one test of the Code of Good Regulatory Practice in itself. It is a complete failure for that regard, and I am utterly appalled that the Minister for Regulatory Reform gave the speech in the form that he did, because he's indicated that this is doing something that it simply isn't doing. Mr Speaker, if there was a single valid reason for having two separate bills, and I, for the life of me, cannot think of one, then why not include this provision within a statutes amendment bill? There is nothing at all that is by any stretch of the imagination controversial about repealing three pieces of legislation that date back to the 19th century. I don't think anyone's going to be opposed to the repeal of the New Zealand Institute of Journalists Act 1895, the New Zealand Shipping Company Limited and Powering Act of 1884, and the District Railways Purchasing Act of 1885. I don't think that we're going to miss those pieces of legislation. I don't think there's anything controversial about repealing them, because they don't have any effect anymore anyway. This is a do-nothing bill that could have been added to a statutes amendment bill in its own right. Mr Speaker, it also has one act from 1934 that it's repealing and one act from 1964. The rest are arranged that date back to the 1980s and the 1990s, and three from this century. So only three of them are in this century that we're repealing. But guess what? Of the 31 acts of Parliament that this bill repeals, 12 of them are repeals of repeal acts. And so all they're doing is repealing the fact that there was a repeal act on the book, not something that anyone would be looking up in our printed statutes, and I'll come back to that in a minute. So, Mr Speaker, if there was a single valid reason not to include this in the regulatory reform bill, then we would have seen it in a statutes amendment bill, except that there is possibly a reason why this Minister for Regulatory Reform wants a separate bill, and that is because he wants to prove that he is delivering on the second principle of the Code of Good Regulatory Practice. And of course, we all know what that is off by heart, don't we? In fact, Aaron Gilmore will know. He probably wrote the Code of Good Regulatory Practice. And what the second principle is what? The first principle is efficiency. What's the second principle? No, you don't know. I didn't think he knew. Anyway, the second principle of good regulatory practice is effectiveness. And so what this minister wants to do is to show he's an effective minister because he's passed all these bills in his name. Well, can I just say that one does not measure effectiveness by quantity. It's in fact quality of the regulation that counts, not the quantity. The numbers of pieces of legislation in the minister's name that are passed in his name actually doesn't meet the test of effectiveness either. And I just wondered whether it had something to do with the fact that the Prime Minister announced that the government would be introducing its own regulatory responsibility bill, and I wondered if that was because Rodney Hyde's old regulatory responsibility bill, because it's a private member's bill, is now in the name of the Honourable Sir Roger Douglas, and so he wants to get that name back on his bill, the regulatory responsibility bill, which of course, if it had been in place at the time that this government had taken office, then that government wouldn't have been able to pass the amount of legislation it did in its first 100 days, because a number of those pieces of legislation failed the test of the regulatory responsibility bill. And if anyone thinks that the union movement wouldn't have gone to court on the 90-day bill, well, I would think that they hadn't really given much thought to how the regulatory responsibility bill would have worked. So, Mr. Speaker, that's why we have the bill. We have the bill because the minister wants to say that he's passed X number of bills, that he's repealed 31 statutes. He's repealed 31 statutes that have no effect, and therefore the repeal of them, it's a little bit multiplying by zero. What happens when you multiply 1 by 0? And what happens when you multiply 150,001 times 0? The answer's still 0, and that is what this minister has produced, 0. Mr. Speaker, unfortunately, this bill also offends Principle 3 of the Code of Good Regulatory Practice, which requires transparency. There is no transparency, Mr. Speaker, in presenting a bill when the explanatory note says this: the maintenance of a quality regulation environment requires ensuring that the existing body of legislation is easy to use, up to date and fit for purpose. Mr. Speaker, it's all very well to say that this is what this bill delivers when all it does is clear from the statute books some unnecessary and spent acts. These are all pieces of legislation that are completely now out of date, no longer have effect or have very limited effect, none of which is relevant to our legal system today. There is nothing about it that actually delivers on it. So let's just look at what the explanatory note says. The maintenance of a quality regulatory environment requires ensuring that the existing body of legislation is easy to use, up to date and fit for purpose. This bill will help achieve this by clearing the statute books of some unnecessary and spent acts. I come back to my point. The legislation that this bill repeals does nothing. The repeal of the legislation that this bill repeals does nothing as well. And there is nothing that the Minister or any one of the MPs on the other side of the House can say that will make it any otherwise. Mr. Speaker, if each of the laws of this bill that it repeals has no effect, then, as I've said, the bill will not do anything other than create the obligation for those who still have printed statute books to update them by crossing out the statutes that have no effect anyway. So all of the books out there in the lobbies, somebody's going to have to come along and open them up at the relevant page back to 1890 something or other, into the 1930s and the 1980s and the 1990s, and put red lines through all of those pages. This is a make-work scene. Maybe they could get someone on Community Max to do it. That would be a very good idea. But actually, it's a very skilled job that has to be done in these areas, because we shouldn't be playing around with our statutes. But who uses the statutes out out there anymore. If you're in your office, you go on to legislation.govt.nz. I don't know how many people are still using the printed statutes, and that's why, again, this is such an irrelevancy and why it doesn't deserve a separate debate and separate referral to the Select Committee. Mr Speaker, the only reason that this is a separate bill is so that the Minister can puff up his chest and claim that he has yet again applied the blowtorch to regulation, and any National Party member who backs him up will prove that they are the patsy that they are.
I call